Hello Total War 3 Kingdoms fans, we are back today with another lore and history video. This one's going to be a bit different. It's not looking at a trailer or gameplay video, but it is a self-made video, basically going over the rise of Cao Cao, who's, as I've said, one of the progenitors of the Three Kingdoms. Now I apologize for my poor video, it's literally a glorified slideshow. I'm sorry, I'm here to educate, not here to entertain. Can't do entertainment. Not talented enough. So, who is Cao Cao? He's often called the hero of chaos. He's also sometimes called the man from the margin. And his deal is essentially that he is a man who is from not one of the most illustrious families. He's from a fairly wealthy family, but he would, through raw talent and will and cunning, go on to found one of the eventual Three Kingdoms. This is a motif that happens often across the Three Kingdoms. Certainly the other two progenitors, Liu Bei and Sun Jian, were also not from the most illustrious families, but I think Cao Cao is the best example of this story. So his son would eventually go on to found the state of Wei. Now Cao Cao himself never really took that extra step of formally declaring a new empire. It seemed like it crossed the moral line for him to usurp the old emperor, so he himself just acted as virtually the head of his own state, but in effect not really. So the state that he would go on to found was called the State of Wei. Now the State of Wei was by far the largest and most powerful of the Three Kingdoms. It was a fairly vast empire. Its borders stretched from modern-day North Korea in the east all the way to the Silk Road in the west. And further to that, it held over half of the people, and it also by far was the leading state in terms of development in, say, the arts, literature, poetry, public works, diplomacy, kind of all the things that in the traditional Confucian worldview a Chinese state is supposed to be responsible for. So in many senses it was the proper successor to the Han Empire. Now, what manner of man is Cao Cao? Well, he is from a wealthy family, as I said, not a politically illustrious family. He's the adopted grandson, or rather his father is the adopted son of a powerful eunuch. Now this poses an interesting contradiction, because the eunuchs were very powerful, but they were widely despised, and they were known for, they were perceived to be incredibly corrupt and greedy and kind of subverting the traditional political order. And in that sense, this basically acted as a, kind of like a negative stereotype that Cao Cao had to really fight against. And he's widely described as an able subject in peace and a cunning hero of chaos. Now this motif, the hero of chaos, this will come up again and again. And essentially all that means is that in peacetime he would be, pretty okay, but very unremarkable. But it's really during the kind of times of war and fracturing that a man who has not the highest station, but a lot of ability and a lot of will and a lot of talent can really rise up. Another quote that's commonly associated with him, this is kind of a Chinese proverb, it's speak of Cao Cao and Cao Cao will come. Now this is basically the Chinese version of speak of the devil, but it is an allusion to, first of all, his military brilliance. He was an incredibly, he was known especially for waging lightning strike campaigns. His talent with logistics and organization meant that he was able to deploy and strike much faster, so it always seemed like he was everywhere at once. And secondly, it also kind of refers to his cunning. Now I think if you ask people who are familiar with the Three Kingdoms, especially across East Asia, whether they like or they hate Cao Cao, the one thing they'll all agree on is that he is cunning. In the way that he dealt with, military stratagem, in the way that he dealt with people, the way he dealt with power. And it can be both a positive and, I guess, negative trait. Usually it's viewed more as a vice than a virtue. So, as I said earlier, Cao Cao is the adopted grandson of a eunuch. But what's interesting here is that he ended up, throughout his early life, kind of aligning against the eunuchs. So he belonged to a political faction known as the Pures. The Pures were mostly children of gentry who opposed the overreach of the eunuchs and opposed their corruption. And actually, in his very, very early career, Cao Cao twice ended up losing his job and basically chased out of town because he was unwilling to kind of stand for corruption. He seemed very headstrong in a sense. He was always butting up against power. In his first posting, he was essentially a gatekeeper, and which is a very junior position, and a very politically powerful man decided to cause disorder, and anybody else would have just let this man go. But Cao Cao ended up carrying out the very harsh penal code and had this man beaten half to death, after which this man complained to his political allies, and Cao Cao was out of a job. So that's really the kind of man he was. Now, his first entry into politics, as I've said, he aligned himself with a faction called the Pures. The Pures were a group of gentry scholars and officials, mostly young, who really saw the corruption and kind of like decay of the Han Empire at that time, and they wanted to go back to a purer, more Confucian, more virtue form of governance. Their primary beef was against the eunuchs. The eunuch faction at this time was led by the 10 attendants, who were kind of the 10 closest eunuchs and confidants of the old emperor. And at this time, the reigning emperor was Emperor Shao, who was barely 10 years old, his father having passed away. He also had a younger brother named the Prince of Chenliu, and really the most powerful person within the family at this time would have actually been his mother, Empress Dowager He. Now, the Empress Dowager and the eunuchs, going back, this is a pattern you see throughout Han Dynasty history, is that they usually oppose each other because they are kind of like the two closest sources of power to the emperor, and they would jockey for power. And at this time, the Empress Dowager He's brother was a man named He Jin, who had been appointed Grand Commandant, which is the highest military rank in the empire technically, and he also directly commanded the Northern Army, which is an army of 4,000 professional soldiers responsible for guarding the capital. So they actually held the military within the capital. Now, He Jin was, the Pures had decided that whilst both sides were responsible for corruption, they aligned themselves with He Jin, that is the Empress Dowager's brother. And the reason they did that is really more because, from a Confucian social viewpoint, at the very least, somebody like He Jin, he held a government position, he drew his power legitimately, and he was related to the Empress Dowager, and to the emperor for that matter. So it made him, a bit more of a legitimate source of authority than eunuchs, who, as far as the Pures were concerned, they had just been gotten there through corruption and nepotism and overreach. I want to be fair to the eunuchs. They get a pretty bad rap through history, but actually, the one good thing you can say about the eunuch faction throughout the Han Empire history is that they were always completely loyal to the emperor. Not in the sense of, we'll carry out your will and give you good advice always, but in the sense of they cannot exist as an institution independent of the emperor. Whereas all these other kind of factions, they have sources of legitimacy outside of the emperor, so it wasn't necessarily always in their interest to make sure the emperor was as powerful as possible. So that's really the reason why the eunuchs often accrued such power, is because the emperor more or less led them, because the emperor usually knew that the eunuchs were would be the one source to never actually rebel against him, because they have no outside sources of authority. Now, the Pures at this time, they aligned themselves with the Empress Dowager. A few of the key members of the Pures would eventually end up becoming some of the most, illustrious and powerful warlords of the Three Kingdoms era. So Cao Cao is one of them. His childhood friend Yuan Shao is, in a sense, the leader of the Pures. Yuan Shao, as I've explained before in previous videos, he is the eldest son from the Yuan family, and the Yuan family is the most illustrious family in the land. They had the honor of having a member of their family each generation, for 3 generations, hold one of the 3 top posts of the empire. His younger half-brother Yuan Shu was also a member of this clan. Yuan Shu is younger than him, but Yuan Shu actually, in some senses, has a better claim than Yuan Shao. Yuan Shu's mother was held in much higher regard than Yuan Shao's mother. So there was kind of, even though they're both from the Yuan family and have similar political leanings, these two men, Yuan Shao and Yuan Shu, actually had a great rivalry between them, and they were always trying to jockey for, you know, who was the proper heir-to-be and future patriarch of the Yuan family. And Cao Cao, you know, whilst he's in there and he's often quite respected, and he has a close personal friendship with Yuan Shao, he usually wasn't as seen as important because his family and his history was not so illustrious. Now, these two factions had engaged in vast political violence against each other across the capital for basically from the 180s onwards for about half a decade. You know, a lot of blood was shed. There was many cases of assassinations, kidnapping, even straight up slaughter of, you know, entire houses. But the event really came to a head when the eunuchs, afraid that He Jin was consolidating too much power, I mean, he had both the army and as well as the pures on his side, they, in the name of the emperor, summoned him into a meeting with the emperor, and then they had him killed in a bloody ambush with dozens of axemen, if we're to be believed. So all of a sudden, they had killed the head of the rival political faction, and as you might have guessed, the pures were furious at this. So they had suddenly lost their leader, and also the northern army, which they always kind of relied on as a powerful leverage, was suddenly leaderless. So the pures were on their own. Now, the pures at this point thought of several ways to deal with the eunuchs. The first way was Yuan Shao's way. Yuan Shao believed that he should call out from the capital to all the regional governors and essentially draw upon the loyal regional governors and tell them, bring your army into the capital and assist us. These eunuchs have gone mad with power. We must kill them. You have to come into the capital and help us. Cao Cao held a completely different view. Cao Cao basically said, no, we can't rely on the regional governors because their loyalty would not be sufficient. We are all, you know, the pures, we're a very large faction. The Empress Dowager also has many allies. We all have our armed retainers and followers. We can take care of the eunuchs on themselves, keep kind of like the regional armies out of the capital. Unfortunately, Yuan Shao overruled that decision, and he went ahead and called up the regional governors. But then, interestingly, he just decided to jump the gun and start the political violence all by himself anyway. So he kind of ended up doing what Cao Cao, you know, said they should have done, and they completely massacred the eunuch faction. It was an absolute bloodbath in the capital. We have historical records of essentially young men on the street being accosted by the pures, and they had to literally take off their pants to show that they weren't eunuchs or be killed on the spot. The eunuchs, the 10 attendants began to die in droves until seeing that they were being massacred, the last 2 survivors of the 10 attendants did something shocking, which is kidnap the emperor. So they kidnapped the emperor and fled the capital. They also kidnapped the emperor's brother, the Prince of Chenliu. And at this point, as if to add more fuel on the fire, the regional governors had arrived. The regional governors that Yuan Shao had called earlier. Now, there's 2 regional governors I want to call out here. Dong Zhuo, who, as anybody who knows anything about 3 Kingdoms will know, eventually goes on to be a tyrant. So what Cao Cao predicted ended up coming true completely. Yuan Shao made just the worst call of his life. And another regional governor who came in was a man named Ding Yuan. He is not a very important character, but I only mention him because he brought along his follower Lu Bu, who was an absolutely ferocious man, full of kind of bravado and martial prowess. And at this time, the eunuchs were being killed off. Dong Zhuo's army, on the way in, meets the remnants of eunuchs who were kidnapping the emperor. They kill off the last of the eunuchs and essentially rescue the emperor back. And at the same time, Dong Zhuo, impressed by Lu Bu's kind of martial prowess, and seeing him as a useful future ally, and also if he didn't bring Lu Bu on side, he would have been a troublesome enemy. He managed to convince Lu Bu to defect, and not only did Lu Bu defect, Lu Bu also killed Ding Yuan and kind of like almost took Ding Yuan's head to Dong Zhuo's camp. So at this point, we had a very awkward political situation. The eunuchs were dead. The Empress Dowager's brother was dead. The northern army was leaderless. Ding Yuan, the other regional governor who answered, was dead. It was just the pures remaining, and Dong Zhuo and his followers, including Lu Bu, remaining. And Dong Zhuo came with an army. He came with an army of 3,000 men. These were very professional, hardened troops. Dong Zhuo was a governor of a northwestern province called the Xiliang, and this was a border garrison. These men would have been very well versed in battle. They would have had to fight all the time against neighboring kingdoms. They recently pacified a rebellion from the Tiang ethnic minority. So Dong Zhuo held all the cards, and worst of all, the northern army eventually mutinied against its commander, who is a younger brother of the Empress Dowager, and they ended up joining Dong Zhuo as well. So suddenly Dong Zhuo held both of the armies in the capital, and there was nobody left to oppose them except the pures, who are, at the end of the day, even though they may be armed and may be very bloody, they don't actually have an army with them. Dong Zhuo, to assert his authority, proposed replacing the emperor. This is seen as just one of the most sacrilegious things you can do in kind of like traditional Chinese culture. The emperor is absolutely sacred, and replacing him went against basically every single Confucian tenet that the pures had upheld and kind of like sought to fight for. So obviously the pures viciously opposed this proposal, but it didn't really matter because Dong Zhuo had all the men, and before long the pures realized what was happening, and Yuan Shu and Cao Cao both fled in short order. Yuan Shao had a confrontation with Dong Zhuo where Dong Zhuo was proposing changing the emperor, and Yuan Shao literally Yuan Shao opposed him very strongly. Lu Bu ended up drawing his sword, and so did Yuan Shao, which is kind of a badass move if you ask me. He's surrounded by enemies, he doesn't have any army, but he drew his sword anyway. He eventually also fled. So the pures ended up fleeing, and Dong Zhuo ended up setting up his regime full of his loyalists, many of which were brought in from his home base of the Xiliang province in northwestern China. And with that, there was really nothing more to it. Nobody was left to oppose him. So within a few brief months, Dong Zhuo had the Emperor Shao deposed, and elevated the Prince of Chenliu to Emperor Xian. Now, the Prince of Chenliu is known to be quite a brave and resourceful boy from youth, but so there was, technically there was maybe some reasons of merit to elevate him. But having said that, this is also just a show of Dong Zhuo's absolute power. And sadly, not long after this, Dong Zhuo had both Emperor Shao and Empress Dowager He poisoned to death. And with that, there was really nothing opposing him from seizing the whole empire. That is, except if the pures were just decided to give up, which they absolutely did not do. Instead of just fleeing to exile to wallow in self-pity, the pures essentially went back to their homelands, the eastern provinces on North China plains, and began to rally their vast networks of political allies, began to mobilize their vast wealth and resources, and they would go on to form the coalition against Dong Zhuo. The coalition of Dong Zhuo was chiefly an alliance of various eastern regional politicians and leaders who were obviously opposed to Dong Zhuo coming in, this border general from the northwest, which is considered a backwater, uncivilized part of the empire, and also very, very opposed to the old emperor being overthrown like that, and the new emperor being held hostage by this usurper. So the eastern and northern parts of China were by far the more populous and deemed to be the more civilized part of China at this time. These illustrious governors raised personal retainers and mass levies Now, the key thing here is that these weren't really military career men, and also their armies were nowhere near as well trained and as well equipped or as battle hardened as Dong Zhuo's army. But nonetheless, what they did have was a kind of sense of just cause, and because these were kind of seen as much more illustrious and much more legitimate powers than Dong Zhuo, and B, what they did have was money and numbers. So pretty soon Dong Zhuo found himself incredibly isolated, as essentially half the country to the east of him had gone up in rebellion. There's a lot of kind of figures associated with this alliance. There were kind of nine of the most prominent lords. It's really pointless to kind of go over all of them, so we're just going to stick to some of the key ones. Yuan Shao, after he fled, was nominated as the leader of this alliance because he was, as I said, the scion of the most illustrious family of the land. Yuan Shu was also nominated as a fairly key member of this alliance. Another key member of this alliance was a man named Zhang Miao. Now, Zhang Miao was a close friend of Cao Cao. Other than that, you had minor warlords such as Han Fu, Liu Dai, Qiao Mao, etc. Now, two members of this alliance who were not key leaders, but they did, they would go on to play a great later role, so you have to call them out. Now, the first one is obviously Cao Cao. Cao Cao raised his own detachment using his family's money and a few key sponsors, and he served under Zhang Miao's camp for this campaign. And the other one is a former merchant named Sun Jian, who would go on really to, what Cao Cao was to one of the three kingdoms, he was to the another kingdom. He was the kind of grand progenitor of another of the three kingdoms, and he would serve under Yuan Shu. Now, Dong Zhuo, faced with such a sudden and overwhelming force against him, we don't know the exact numbers, but we know for a fact that just the Eastern Front, which is one of 5 fronts of the alliance, just the Eastern Front, there were 100,000 men. Now, even though these were poorly trained, newly raised mass levies, Dong Zhuo still realized how isolated he was, because his base of support, as I said, was in the northwest in Xiliang, all the way very far away, and he had very few armies to hold the capital against this sudden onslaught. So he decided, in a very shocking but military sensible move, to retreat to the western capital, the traditional western capital of Chang'an, which is closer to his home base and also further away from the eastern provinces, so it would be much more easily defendable. There are a lot of mountain passes, that guard Chang'an from the east, so it would be much harder to approach that. But he, in kind of his trademark ruthlessness mixed with low cunning, also did not want to leave the capital for the advancing coalition, because that would be a huge kind of logistical and strategic gain for them to hold such an important city, but B, it was more just it was just more seen as a very symbol of legitimacy. So if the coalition ended up holding the capital, this would be a huge blow to his legitimacy. And he did the unthinkable. He ended up not only evacuating the capital, but also burning it to the ground to kind of, in a scorcher strategy, to deny the advancing coalition any gains. The capital city of Luoyang was one of the most developed cities in the world at this time, easily equal to any of the larger cities of the Roman Empire, and he razed it with fire. The record of the Three Kingdoms tells us, and I quote, "His soldiers burned Luoyang as well as 100 li outside of the city," so that's 50 kilometers, a diameter of 50 kilometers. "He sent his soldiers to burn the north and south palaces, as well as the ancestral temple, the storehouses, even the common people's homes. Everything within the city was swept away. All the various riches collected were put in his personal belongings. The amount of innocent deaths were beyond counting." So this was essentially a death march, and he had also burned the ancestral temple, which is another sign of utmost sacrilege. This is the ancestral imperial tombs. He burnt and looted it. So this, other than being a devastating blow for the empire as a whole, was a huge propaganda coup for the coalition, because there's no doubt after this that Dong Zhuo is a tyrant, as if poisoning the emperor and the empress dowager wasn't enough. but also that he was a very cruel tyrant. Yet, despite this, the coalition didn't really advance. The first thing is that they were wary of facing Dong Zhuo's veteran troops, and the second thing is that they knew that anybody who took the brunt of the fighting would have a relatively weaker position than the rest of the coalition. They organized themselves into 5 fronts. I'm going to call out just 3 fronts here because the other 2 fronts really weren't that important. So on the northern front, this was led by Yuan Shao. They made some probing attacks to the southwest direction towards the capital, but were easily fended off, so they really didn't do much during the entire campaign. Now the eastern front, there was no overall leader of the eastern front, but this was the front Cao Cao was in. And it also had the most direct line of attack to the capital. However, they kind of just sat idle. The only big advance was made on the southern front by Sun Jian, who acted as the vanguard of the southern front, which was commanded by Yuan Shu. Dong Zhuo had sent his generals out to face all the fronts whilst he retreated to cover his retreat. And on the southern front, he had deployed 2 of his best generals, the General Hua Xiong, and also, more importantly, Lu Bu, the so-called god of war, this man that Dong Zhuo had worked so hard to convince to come over to his cause. And to everybody's shock, Sun Jian kept winning. Sun Jian first engaged Hua Xiong in battle and killed Hua Xiong, and then he defeated Lu Bu and sent Lu Bu routing as well. And at this point, Dong Zhuo kept fleeing, and his southern front was collapsing. And Cao Cao made the case to the eastern front. It's like, we should go now. Dong Zhuo had put some rear guard behind, but that's no reason for us not to advance. We're sitting on 100,000 men. And what he said was, we rallied men of righteousness to destroy oppression and disorder. Now that we're united, why do you hesitate? The empire is in disorder and nobody knows where to turn to. This is the time when Dong Zhuo is condemned by heaven. One battle and the empire will be settled. We must not lose this opportunity. So what he was thinking of here was not only the strategic case for advance, but also the moral case, because Cao Cao was an ideologue at this time. However, none of the other coalition leaders within the Eastern Front really agreed with him, so Cao Cao marched off on his own with his own force, which was estimated to be anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men to chase after Dong Zhuo. It should be mentioned that his good friend Zhang Miao did send a few reinforcements, a detachment of about 1,000 men under a man named Wei Zi, who is a friend of Cao Cao as well, but otherwise he was completely unsupported. And he began to advance as well, and facing him was a rear guard, one of Dong Zhuo's generals, a man named Xu Rong, who commanded a force. We don't know how many, it would have been a few thousand men, but the point is, these men would have been much better trained and equipped than Cao Cao's men, because, as I said, the coalition, all they really had was their numerical advantage. And so battle happened, and it was called the Battle of Xingyang, and this battle was completely disastrous. Cao Cao almost died at this battle, and his good friend who led the other detachment, Wei Zi, did actually die. It was said that at one point Cao Cao fell from his horse in the middle of the battle, and or rather his horse was shot out under him, and in the melee, as he was trying to fight his way out, his cousin and an officer under him, Cao Hong, rode past, got off his own horse and put Cao Cao on his horse. Cao Cao at this point said, why are you doing this? You need a horse as well. And Cao Hong replied the famous line, the empire can live without me, cousin, but it cannot live without you. So after this disastrous battle, Cao Cao retreated. Xu Rong originally contemplated chasing him, but it wasn't a rout. So what Xu Rong noted of the battle was that Cao Cao's men were remarkably well disciplined, despite being, theoretically so fresh and so under-supported. So even in this time, we could see that Cao Cao had some competencies in command. Cao Cao would go back to his camp, where he would be absolutely dismayed by the fact that the rest of the illustrious lords and their 100,000 men just sat around all day. Apparently the lords were feasting and drinking themselves into a stupor. Cao Cao came up with a second plan. He essentially proposed to the lords, okay, we can't beat Dong Zhuo on the open field, I was wrong. However, the coalition must move. If we keep staying here, we'll lose momentum, and we'll also lose not only our strategic momentum, but the sense of legitimacy that we have among the people. So what he suggested was that the Eastern Front and the Southern Front advance and set up a series of blockades, kind of, you know, in those mountain passes before Chang'an, the western capital that Dong Zhuo had retreated to. And in this sense, they wouldn't have to fight Dong Zhuo, but they would cut him off from the rest of the empire, where the majority of resources, supply, and more importantly, legitimacy lay. And trapped in Chang'an, Dong Zhuo's regime would quickly fall apart. So that was his second proposal. And again, nobody answered his call. So at this point, completely disillusioned by this coalition, and also predicting that it would fall to pieces unless it quickly moves on, Cao Cao decides to leave the coalition. And true to his prediction, within a matter of a month, the coalition shattered and gave rise to the end of the Han Empire. So, within the next few months, in 191 AD, Cao Cao's predictions would come true very, very quickly. That is, the coalition fell to infighting. What Cao Cao understood is that without the momentum of a constant advance and a political and military goal, the kind of conflicts and contradictions between all these personalities and interests within the coalition would start to manifest. First of all, Han Fu, who is one of the key commanders in the Northern Front, decided to stop supplying Yuan Shao. And in response to this, Yuan Shao essentially began to attack him. And he also allied with a governor further north in the You province called Gongsun Zan to also attack him. So the Northern Front basically collapsed. Within the Eastern Front, which kind of held together more or less despite its inactivity, a quarrel started between the governors Liu Dai and the governor Qiao Mao, and Liu Dai began to attack Qiao Mao. Now within the Southern Front, because Sun Jian had been making such vast advances and winning such glory for his commander Yuan Shu, the old rivalry between the Yuan brothers essentially started again, and Yuan Shao, basically in an attempt to check Yuan Shu's growth of influence, bade his allies in the south to attack Sun Jian. Now Yuan Shu, in response to this, sent his own ally Gongsun Yue, who is actually the brother of Gongsun Zan, to rescue Sun Jian. So this formed a very interesting situation where the Yuans and the Gongsuns were on both sides of the war across the northern and southern front. And this fell apart very, very quickly. So within the next few months, in the north, Han Fu had been killed by his own mutineering soldiers, whilst he was losing a war to Yuan Shao and Gongsun Zan. In the Eastern Front, Liu Dai had killed Qiao Mao, and that essentially ended the unity of the Eastern Front. In the Southern Front, within a year's time, Yuan Shao's allies in the south, namely two governors named Liu Biao and Huang Zu, had killed Sun Jian, and they had also killed Gongsun Ye. Without Sun Jian, the rest of the Sun family, led by Sun Jian's eldest son Sun Ce, had to retreat and kind of, follow Yuan Shu again, whilst Yuan Shu and Sun Ce ended up in open war against Liu Biao and Huang Zu. Now, to complicate this situation further, Gongsun Zan, that is Gongsun Yue's older brother, blamed Yuan Shao for the death of his younger brother, so these former co-belligerents went to war instantaneously. So across the entirety of Eastern China, from the north to the south, there was essentially just a free-for-all. You can't really even call it a civil war because there was just not enough sides, and it was a lot of backstabbing, backbiting, scheming, and jockeying for power. And another one of Cao Cao's prophecies came true very soon as well, and that is his prophecy that cut off from the rest of the empire, Dong Zhuo would fall apart very quickly. So whilst Dong Zhuo did retreat to Chang'an and his military situation looked completely secure, the infighting between kind of the remnants of the court and his own camp took over, and before long, Lü Bu had led a coup d'etat against Dong Zhuo and killed him, and then went to war against Dong Zhuo's remaining loyalist generals, namely Li Jue and Guo Si. So within under a year of Cao Cao leaving, basically the entire empire had fragmented to a state that can only be described as warlordism. Central authority and any kind of alliance or coalition had essentially ceased to exist. So where does this leave Cao Cao? Well, Cao Cao had gone off to essentially gather troops and gather heroes to start his own faction, as it were. And unfortunately, this video has stretched on for far longer than I anticipated. So at the start of this video, I said this was going to be part 1 of a 3 or 4 part. It's now looking like it's going to be part 1 of at least a 5-parter. But that's okay, because as I keep saying, we have a long time until the actual game comes out, so there's a long time to go over these laws. So the next time I will go over how Cao Cao began to establish a foothold, how he essentially became an independent, powerful faction, and then some of the kind of early conflicts he went through, which were just some of the edge of your seat and daring and dangerous conflicts, and you know, when he probably claimed the closest to losing it all. So thanks once again all for listening. If you made it this far, hope this has been educational as always, and I will see you next time. Thank you. I am out.